History Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're having an interview with Mr. Freeman this morning. My name is Stephen Goldfarb. Mr. Freeman, would you introduce yourself, spell your last name, tell us a little bit about your background, and tell us about your work experience.
Well, I'll start off by saying I'm Henry Freedman. Everybody calls me Hank. My last name is spelled F-R-E-E-D-M-A-N. I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm the oldest of three. I have a younger sister and a younger brother who are still alive. And as far as my background growing up is concerned, unfortunately, when I was about 8 and a half, my mother passed away. And my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, decided at that time that my dad, who was a World War I veteran and fought in the trenches in France during World War I, would not be able to take care of us. So she made the big decision that various members of the family would adopt my brother and I and my sister. So my grandparents adopted my brother and myself. An aunt and uncle adopted my sister. The big point of all of this is that my name used to be Miller. It became Freedman through adoption. I had 3 uncles, brothers of my mother. My uncles became my brothers. My sister did not know that she was my sister, and the family did not want her to know that she was my sister. And so she grew up until she was 20 years old, not knowing that she had 2 brothers. I made the mistake one time of sending her a birthday card. And this was before I went overseas. I was in the service. And I signed the card, "Your loving brother." When I got home, the family absolutely blew their top. My grandmother was a very dominant person, and it was her idea that those different things would take place with regard to the upbringing of us 3. I feel very grateful that grandparents did what they did. I might add, I'm a very sentimental person. And if I get a little emotional, you'll have to forgive me as I recollect everything. But at any rate, I went through the various elementary and grade schools and high school and graduated high school in Boston. And I had an uncle / brother who was a druggist, and my grandmother felt that since he was successful in the pharmacy business, I should study pharmacy as well, which I did for about a year, and it was not anything that I was particularly fond of. So I gave that up and just simply went to work.
What year would this be now?
Well, my mother passed away in 1932. 1930. She was 32 years of age. And so the years progressed. And I eventually went into the service in October 1942. I was working at the time of Pearl Harbor.
Give us your birth date so we can
Birth date was September 21st, 1921.
Okay, so you were then 21 years old.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so I was drafted. I was working. I might add that I found out afterwards, inasmuch as I was the sole support of my grandmother, my grandfather had passed away. He died when I was 15. And so I was the sole support. And under the terms of the laws and the rules that the government had made, I was not even supposed to have been drafted. But nonetheless, I was. and I served in the U.S. Army. I entered the service in October 1942. I joined the 79th Infantry Division, 313th Regiment, K Company, and I trained as a machine gunner. And went on maneuvers with the division in Tennessee. In those days, we really didn't have mechanized infantry as they have today. We walked everywhere we went.
Tell us about the machine gun.
These were 30 caliber air-cooled machine guns that sat on a tripod, and they also equipped you with an asbestos glove. So if the occasion arose that it was more practical to hold the gun and use it as a machine gun or as a Browning automatic rifle, as we used to call them in those days, a BAR, that's what we did. And I was a trained machine gunner. And I could hit anything in 50 yards that I set my mind to, but a little bit of trivia. And at the end of maneuvers in about the spring of 1943, I was given papers, a test, and there I was on the ground answering a million questions. I had no idea what the test was all about. About a month later, while in my bivouac area, I was informed by the company clerk that the test that I took turned out to be very good and so forth, and the government was sending me to school. So, to shorten the story a little bit, I was transferred to the University of Alabama, studying engineering at Tuscaloosa. And I went there for 9 months, and then they transferred me to Auburn University, studying engineering. The whole point of the program was that the government was short of officers in the engineering area, and they wanted us to do 4 years of school in 18 months and be commissioned in the Corps of Engineers. It so happened that about the spring of '44, after about a year in the program, the government shut the program down. In the meantime, my outfit, the original outfit, the 79th Division, which had gone on maneuvers, had already shipped out for the European theater. And I might add that somewhere along the line, I think the good Lord has looked over me, because they hit Normandy Beach in D-Day +2 and suffered tremendous casualties. A lot of fellows that I knew and buddied with and served with were killed or wounded in that action. And at any rate, so it was a matter of reassigning me, and there was a division up in Camp Atterbury, Indiana, 106th Infantry Division, known as the Golden Lions. And I might add that my email address right now is Golden Lion, HEF. And I happen to be the only one in the whole division who carries the Golden Lion reference in his email. For whatever that's worth, I don't know, but I mentioned it anyway. So I further trained with the 106th Infantry, but in this particular case, for whatever reason, they assigned me to Regimental Headquarters Company, INR. Now, INR means Intelligence and Reconnaissance. And that's what I wound up in. So all of the machine gun training that I had would now be devoted to either a rifle or a pistol or a Tommy, a submachine gun, as a weapon, in addition to all the other duties that I had to do, which basically was to communicate with the rest of the companies in the regiment, to lay wire, as it were. We didn't have too much in the way of wireless equipment. Motorola had made a sort of a walkie-talkie that you could communicate with. And so I finished training with them, and in October was transferred to Miles Standish in Massachusetts, 44. And from there, we were sent to Hoboken, New Jersey, and we loaded on the SS Aquitania and sailed over to Glasgow, Scotland. All of these things are very vivid in my memory. I remember it was a very fast passenger ship. It was an English vessel, and it took us about 4 days. We had no escort or anything like that. They did have guns mounted on the deck, but
It outrun the submarine.
to outrun the submarines. That's exactly right. And so we further trained in England for a short while. Then we loaded on LSTs and went across the English Channel and landed in France.
Was that stormy weather? That could be pretty.
At that time, it was very choppy and the waves were extremely high, but my memory of that trip was that the Navy perhaps eats better than any other branch of the service. So the best meal I had overseas was on that LST going to France. And so we moved across northern France and did our thing as we moved across, wherever we met up with the enemy. We had our little pitched battles. We captured a couple of towns. And then we moved into the Belgium Luxembourg area. And about the beginning of December of 1944.
It was already plenty cold out.
And it was very cold, 0 degrees, a lot of snow on the ground, very cloudy. There was not too much in the way of air support because the planes could not fly at that time. And we were in an aggressive mode, you might say, attacking and just trying to prod the German lines and see where the weaknesses were. In the meantime, they were doing a tremendous job of finding our weaknesses. They had been there for a long, long time, and we had actually relieved another division when we moved in on that front. Excuse me. And so it so happened that history tells us that the 16th of December is when the Battle of the Bulge started. And the Germans started their counteroffensive. Excuse me.
You were in intelligence, and this was a complete surprise.
Complete surprise. That's exactly right. And other intelligence that was available to us never indicated that. But as I said, they had done a very good job of finding out where our weaknesses were. And in preparation for this last offensive, as it were, this was Hitler's last great opportunity, with his goal being Antwerp, Belgium. He wanted to get to Antwerp and get to the English Channel. And at that point, seal off all the Allied forces with an idea of invading England. And that was partly the reason that they did so much bombing over in England, to try to soften it up and damage some of their resource areas and so forth. So there we were in front of this tremendous German offensive. And suffice to say, we did everything we could. But the first thing that the Germans did was to knock out our artillery. And inasmuch as we had no support from the Air Force, and the artillery was gone, and the Germans had their Tiger tanks, 88 millimeter guns, and there we were trying to fight them off with machine guns, with rifles, with rifle grenades, and things of that nature. And so my regiment, the 422nd Regiment, was the easternmost outfit along that Allied front. And the 423rd Infantry was adjacent to us, the 424th was south of us. And ironically, we were attacking at that time. When it happened? Well, everything happened in about 3 days, and on the 19th of December, 1944, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as I recall, I was captured. There were about 25 of us that had become isolated. And the Germans had their tanks about 1,000 yards away, and we could see them. But we had nothing no way to try to counterattack or even stave them off. And they were just hitting us with everything they had. And we were in the forest. We were in this Ardennes area. Another reference is called the Schnee Eifel. And that's another section of that particular area. And I was captured in the town of Blyalf, Germany. And that was in the afternoon. And they lined us up, as I had previously stated. The German sergeant wanted to shoot us because they were on a very strict timetable. And the 106th Infantry, which comprised about 15,000 men, suffered about 8,000 casualties, a little over 8,000 casualties. Dead, wounded, prisoners, etc. And so it was, it was pretty much touch and go. And during the searching that they did of us, I had this little diary, this diary right here that I had brought from England. And this particular diary is filled with all kinds of places that I was going to visit, foods that I was going to eat, and cities and so forth. It even contains various recipes and all. And it contains almost a day-by-day recap of the time that I was in the prison camp. They called them Stalags. I was at 2 Stalag. I was at Stalag 9B, Bad Orb. I was in Stalag 9A, Ziegenhain.
Well, but they let you keep it.
They let me keep it. The German officer had his way. He told the sergeant, I'm going to make the decisions, and I'm going to determine whether we're going to let these men live or whether we're going to kill them and go on.
You don't know any German, so you...
I can understand a little Yiddish.
So you can
There's a similarity between Yiddish and German. In fact, one of the fellows next to me kept asking me, what are they talking about? What kind of an argument's going on? And I told him, I said, well, the German sergeant wants to kill us, and the German lieutenant is telling him that he's the guy in command, and he's the one that's going to make the decisions. So the guy next to me said, well, I hope the lieutenant wins the argument. Well, obviously he did, because I'm here to tell you all about it. And so...
That must have been really frightening.
Well, it was, because I think I mentioned earlier, when you go into combat, you have 2 thoughts. One, you're going to get killed, and one, you're going to get wounded. And you hope that the wounds will not be too serious or life-threatening. The idea of becoming a POW really never enters your mind.
Was there any training, basic training, about what to do if you were a POW?
No.
I know there is now, but...
Well, the only part of the training was that you gave your name, rank, and serial number. And there was a little incident that I'll tell you about when we got to the first prison camp as to what happened along those lines. And so the Germans got us together, moved us into a church courtyard, and there we slept. And we all huddled. We made ourselves a little pyramid of bodies trying to stay warm. And the next morning they moved us out. And we marched to, I don't know,
So now it's December 20th.
This is December, that's right, December 20th.
1940.
Right. And so their whole idea, as it turned out, was that we had to go someplace where they could load us on boxcars and take us to the prison camp. The first town we went to, Prum, was a area that had been highly bombed by our Air Force, and all the railroad tracks were sticking up in the air. So that precluded any trains from traveling in that area. So we kept walking, and we walked another 15 or 18 miles, and we got to a town called Gerolstein. And that's where we loaded on what is known as 40 and 8 boxcars. 40 and 8 boxcars comes from the days of World War I, and where the car would hold either 8 horses or 40 men. And, but in our case, it not only held 40, they put about 65 men into a car. I mean, it was jammed and all. And we were in that car for a number of days. And on Christmas Eve, we were sitting in the freight yards near Frankfurt and got bombed by the RAF. The cars were not marked. So the RAF obviously didn't know what was down on the ground. The only thing they did know was that it was a marshalling area for German armor and German equipment, rolling equipment as we call it. And we kept yelling for the German guards to open the door and let us out, because we were sitting ducks. Well, nothing like that happened because the German guards had already taken off. They wanted to save their own skin. We did notice and feel that there were bombs, shells landing pretty close to us. Finally, the next morning, the Germans opened the door and let us out, and we saw where 2 cars down had been hit flush, and 60 guys had been wiped out. So we continued. The next day, Christmas Day, we arrived at Stalag 9B, called Bad Orb. Now, Bad Orb was not a nice stalag by any means. The Jewish men were isolated, and then I was a non-com, which was fortunate, because that was one of the few rules of the Geneva Convention that the Germans adhered to. Non-coms under the Geneva Convention don't have to work, and non-coms are supposed to be treated a little bit better than privates and PFCs.
Non-com meaning non-combatant?
Non-commissioned officer,
Non-commissioned officer.
like a sergeant, staff sergeant, corporal, whatever.
What was your rank?
I was a sergeant. And so at that particular camp, after a month, they moved me out to Stalag 9A, which was Ziegenhain.
Let me go back. You mentioned the Jewish POWs being separated.
Right, right.
How did they determine you were Jewish?
Well, there were probably 3 ways. Number one,
I can think of one of them.
well, one, you told them. Number 2, your dog tags indicated your religion.
Oh, they did.
Yes. So for a Jewish soldier, it was an H. And if you were a Methodist, or if you were Catholic, or a Gentile, it reflected the type of religion that you had indicated to the army.
Germans knew this.
And the Germans knew this. Now, I have to say that a lot of Jewish guys threw their dog tags away. In fact, a lot of guys threw their dog tags away. They didn't even want the Germans to know what the name was, as far as that goes. So at that, as I stated or implied a little while ago, when we got to the camp, one of the first things they did was to ask us our whole family history, what our family name was, where we came from, the names and addresses of our relatives and things of that nature. And of course, we didn't tell them. We said, here is my name, this is my rank, and this is my serial number, and that's all you're going to get. So what they did, they stripped us to the waist and took us outside and said that, you know, you're going to stay out here in this weather as long as necessary until we get the information that we want. And we were out there for several hours, and an American officer who happened to be there, I guess took pity on us. And he said, look, guys, you know, it's stupid and it's ridiculous for you to persist in not giving them the information. He says, I understand your training and the kind of information that you are supposed to give them. But in this case, tell them what they want to know so you can get back inside where it's a lot warmer.
What was it, 10 degrees out? Or?
0.
0.
Yeah. So we still insisted that we weren't going to do it. And eventually, the Germans got frustrated. One thing I found out about the Germans in this particular case, they have no patience. So if you're a patient person, you usually can outlast them. It's just a matter of making up your mind, you know, what you're going to do, what the circumstances are involved, and so forth. So eventually they said, you know, let's forget about this. Go ahead, back in the barracks. And that's when they assigned us to various barracks. And I have all the barracks numbers in this little diary. And as I said, we were there for about a month, and then they moved us out. Now, what they did with the Jewish privates and PFCs and a number of other men who were not Jewish, they moved them to a camp called Bulge. Now, Bulge was a camp run by the people who handled the Holocaust, who were killing people in ovens and slaughtering them and so on. And they took these men and put them to work in mines. And what the Germans were trying to do was dig and establish underground mines where they could build the resources they needed to continue the war. And these poor guys didn't get any more food. They worked under just absolutely slave conditions. The fact that they were GIs, the fact that they were American soldiers, is what actually saved their lives. Because, as I said, these were the same people that were slaughtering civilians. So that's what happened there. I happened to have one of the men that went was from my hometown. I knew him very well. And he never made it because of the conditions. And so that was the Stalag, or the camp. It was called Bulge. More recently, I think some of those men, if they applied, could have gotten some kind of compensation through the German government for the way they were treated.
But you avoided this because you were a sergeant?
Right, right. Now, I might add that I did get a form like the other men got, requesting compensation. But I simply, you know, wrote a note on there and said I'm not entitled to it. I didn't go to Bulge. You know, thank God I didn't experience what they did. So that's what we experienced. I was at Stalag 9A, Ziegenhain, for the balance of the time. I was actually liberated about the first week in April of 1944. Our diet consisted of a can of soup and a piece of bread, and that was it. We had no washing facilities. Several times, as indicated on here, they deloused us and all, and the International Red Cross, in my opinion, did a very, very poor job in policing these stalags, in seeing to it that they got proper food, and in seeing to it that the men received their Red Cross packages. If we had received Red Cross packages once a week per man, as we were supposed to, it wouldn't have mattered whether the Germans fed us or not. We would have subsisted very nicely, because the packages consisted of all types of food, concentrated foods, cigarettes and powdered milk, and very, very highly concentrated chocolate bars and food.
Did you get any of them? Did you ever
We got 3. And again, I indicated it here. The first one we split amongst 4 men. And the second one, several weeks later, we split amongst 8 men. And the last one we split amongst 12 men. Well, in retrospect, as I think about it, it's a little humorous, because you take a can of sardines and start splitting it amongst 12 men, the sardines don't go too far. So you have to, there are a lot of compromising going on. I'll swap you one sardine for this, or that kind of thing. And
Tell us a little bit about the other fellows who were in it, and have you kept up with them?
Yes, I've got several buddies that, and I have been able to go to some reunions, and I also might add that we do have reunions once a year of the Stalags. And we had one this past year in the spring in Orlando, Florida. And I met with a bunch of guys. And thank God those that are left are managing. They're,
Did you have a best friend?
Huh?
Did you have a best friend amongst these people?
I had a best friend in the 79th Division. And he has since passed away. He was a Hungarian fellow by the name of Andrew Fackety. And he lived in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. We became very, very close friends. I mean, real buddies. Real buddies. The action that took place during the Battle of the Bulge, to some extent, was such you didn't have that much time to establish a relationship. Now I know, and I know of many cases where in various companies the guys would share a foxhole, or they would share a particular area, or an experience, and things of that nature. And you know, that is nice, and it's good. And I have gone to reunions where a bunch of guys, let's say from H Company, maybe a dozen guys from H Company, were able to stay together down through the years and communicate with each other and so forth, and really become close friends. In fact, the last reunion that I went to in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati, I was sort of adopted by H Company people because my old outfit, the headquarters company, 422nd, I was the only one there. Now, I communicate with several guys. There's a fella in Washington. There's a fella in Pennsylvania. There's a fellow in Chicago. There's one in Texas, Massachusetts. There's about a half a dozen that I stay in contact with. And we renew our remembrances, you might say, and we're all thankful for the years that we have and hope to have. I'm certainly not a young guy by any means, but I have to say very honestly, I don't feel my age. I have a son, two sons. I have one son in Orlando, Florida. I have a son in Suwanee, Georgia, near where I live. Each son had two girls. And so I have, my wife unfortunately passed away this past January. Next month will be a year. We were married for 51 years.
Okay, so let's get back to tell me, is there anything you want to say about the offices that you served with? You apparently were, if you were in headquarters, you were around offices. Any names you want to give us? Any?
Well, I have several. Well, Major General Alan Jones was head of the division. And we had Colonel Cavender, and there was another colonel, there was a lieutenant, and there was, well, my immediate superior, Captain Foster, was from Knoxville, Tennessee. And he was our commanding officer. And he was with us at the time of our capture.
Okay, but they separated him out?
Yes. He went with us, but eventually he was separated. Right. The comment, I guess, that I can make with regard to the officers and with regard to how they handled themselves, we had a very nice group of officers. They were all gentlemen. They were all men who had served in the Army for quite some time, and men with compassion, and people type people, as it were.
Were they good warriors? Or?
And yes, we had, I guess to this day, we all feel that from General Eisenhower on down, the officers at the very high level did not make decisions that were right as far as we were concerned. History has proven and in some of these papers that I have, it would be indicated that they had some Army units, combat units, in reserve. And when the time came that you needed to help out the 422nd, my outfit, because it was surrounded and being badly battered because they had no artillery, our thoughts were, where's our artillery? Certainly we got other artillery battalions that can be brought up. We have cannon company, we have anti-tank company groups that could have been brought up. The 422nd, my outfit, and the 423rd were devastated. The 424th, which was south of us, they managed to pull back, and they didn't suffer as many casualties as we did.
What kind of percentage of casualties did you have? Do you
Well,
have
in total, over 50% of the division.
of the division? What about your
In my outfit, it was just about 50%. Killed, wounded, with most of the casualties prisoners.
like yourself?
Right. I was, according to some newspaper things that I've seen, my family heard that I was missing in January. They didn't know until March that I was a prisoner.
And now this is 45.
That was 45. That's exactly right. And so
How did they find out?
through the Army,
Through the Red Cross?
and yes, and through the chain of command, as the information was progressed through the various Army outfits, and they began to be able. You can kind of imagine that around the 16th of December, when the Germans started their counteroffensive, it was chaos, absolute chaos. The Germans, well, just to give you a few little details that I can, for instance, the coldest, snowiest weather in memory in the Ardennes forest on the German-Belgian border. Now, these are all battle facts. And they don't ever recall that a battle was fought. I might add that the Battle of the Bulge was the largest land battle that this country was ever engaged in. So that gives you some idea of the scope. Over 1 million men, 500,000 Germans, 600,000 Americans, and more than fought at Gettysburg. And 55,000 British were involved in this battle. 3 German armies, 10 corps, the equivalent of 29 divisions. And when you consider there's 15,000 men to a division, what we're talking about here in terms of personnel. 3 American armies, 6 corps, the equivalent of 31 divisions. 100,000 German casualties killed, wounded, or captured. 81,000 American casualties, including 23,000 captured and 19,000 killed. 1,400 British casualties, 200 killed. And each side lost 800 tanks. And the Germans lost 1,000 aircraft. And the air support that the Americans eventually got, as far as we're concerned, came kind of late. But at least it came. And it turned everything around. No question about it. The Battle of the Bulge actually, officially, lasted from the 16th of December to the 25th of January. Those were the inclusive dates that in which it took place. In addition to that, the Malmedy Massacre, which was near us, 86 Americans were murdered. And that's what that German sergeant wanted to do to us. There were only about 25 of us at that time. And my division, the 106th Infantry Division, average age 22, suffered 564 killed, 1,200 wounded, and 7,000 missing in action. At the end of the offensive, that was January. And most of the casualties occurred within the first 3 days. And 2 of the division's 3 regiments were forced to surrender. But they didn't surrender as regiments. It was in groups that it all happened. It worked out that way, but it was in groups. In my group, as I said, we were only about 25 guys. And in its entirety, the Battle of the Bulge was one of the worst battles in terms of losses to the American forces in World War II. And to go on, mid-December, 3 powerful German armies plunged into the semi-mountainous, heavily forested Ardennes region of eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg. That's where we were. Their goal was to reach the sea, trap the Allied armies, and impel a negotiated peace. That was their goal. And I would like to think, and history has shown, that as much damage as we experienced, we stopped them. We slowed them down until other forces could come, into being, including the Air Force, and really start to decimate their forces. And thinking the Ardennes was the least likely spot for a German offensive, the American staff commanders chose to keep the line thin. So there's the weakness in the decision-making that the top brass made, and what I was referring to earlier. And so that the manpower might concentrate on offensives north and south of the Ardennes. And we were in that middle. And we were in that as the Germans moved in, and that's where the name Bulge comes in. They created that bulge with Allied forces on the north and Allied forces in the south. And that's division sectors were more than double the width of normal defensive fronts. So to some extent, when you consider that our artillery was knocked out, we were pretty defenseless. And it's like a guy coming in here with a 9mm gun, and all you're armed with is a pea shooter. I think the analogy is proper. And in snow and sub-freezing temperature, the Germans fell short of their interim objective, that of reaching the Meuse River on the fringe of the Ardennes. And all the Germans accomplished was to create a bulge in the American line. In the process, they expended irreplaceable men, tanks, material, and 4 weeks after grim fighting with heavy losses on both sides, the bulge ceased to exist. It was closed up. And they had turned around and were hightailing it towards Berlin.
So let's get back to, okay, so you're in your second prison camp, and tell us about liberation.
Well, at Stalag 9A, Ziegenhain, it turned out to be a rather monotonous kind of existence. I filled out what I could in terms of daily information.
How many people in the camp?
There were about 1,200 Americans. There were some French Moroccans, there were British, there were Russians. The French and the camp was split down the middle with a road. And there was barbed wire that separated barracks on one side and barracks on the other. The barracks themselves were partly wood and stone, outdoor latrine, still at 0 degrees, sanitary conditions non-existent, no real ability to shave, shower, wash. I never took my uniform off except when we were deloused, about 3 times in about 4 to 5 months.
Did they just wash you, or did they have some?
They didn't have anything. I mean, there was a little bit of running water, or you could use a pail. What some of the guys would do, and the Russians particularly, because we watched them, they would dig through the snow to get at the grass underneath, and they would pull the grass up, and they would put it in their helmets and try to get some hot water, or try to build a fire and boil water, and make a soup out of it. Well, when I got my rations, my slice of bread and my can of soup, I gulped it down. There were some, you might say, buddies of mine, who when they got their bread, some of us had made little knives out of pieces of metal that we could find. So they would take that little slice of bread. That slice of bread was almost an inch thick. And they would take that slice of bread and cut little slices out of it. And they would nibble on it and put the rest in their pocket. And at night, other so-called buddies would sneak around and steal the bread out of the pockets. So one motivation that I had, as I said, get the bread, swallow it. I mean, saving it and trying to eat it piecemeal doesn't give you any more nutrition than eating it all in one gulp. And the same way for the soup. And as I said, we did get 3 Red Cross packages in a period of about 4 to 5 months, which was, believe me, very welcome. And we lived like kings for an hour or so because we had to split that package amongst all the men. So we didn't really wind up with that much to go around. We had a few cigarettes. They were very welcome. It was great to take a big puff and inhale and blow out that smoke. But I continued for the balance of the time, and they had a radio, a loud radio in the camp, and what they did, they would announce the goings-on the various fronts for the German men that were there, the guards and so on. They had, they had outposts around the camp, machine guns planted. There was one little tragic experience one time. One of the men, one of the German guards, started firing at an American plane that was coming back from a mission. And the plane was kind of low. We happened to be outside at the time. And we saw it all happen. And as he started shooting at this plane, the plane was heading away, and maybe the pilot didn't realize what was down on the ground. All he could see was this German machine gunner trying to get him. And he obviously got mad, and before we knew it, the plane banked and came down, and even before he reached the camp, we could see his guns going from, out of his wings. And it was at that time that the Germans started yelling, "Los, los, los, los." That meant, get back in the barracks right now. So we got back in the barracks. We tried to get underneath benches, anything, because we knew what was going to happen. And sure enough, these 50 caliber slugs started flying through the barracks, through the wood. And unfortunately, they hit about a half a dozen French that were a little further down, and then later on that day, the Germans told us, you see, what your allies are doing to you, they're trying to kill you. Well, that was propaganda, obviously. But they made a big deal out of carrying the bodies of these 6 Frenchmen to a cemetery not far outside the camp. And so that was one of those little incidents that took place. Other than that, it was, as I said, kind of a everyday routine. Now and then they'd smack you with a gun butt and yell at you, and we would cuss them out in English, which they couldn't understand. So we had a ball doing all of that. The big problem was we knew they couldn't understand, so we weren't getting any satisfaction out of it.
Were the Jewish, in the second camp, were the Jewish prisoners?
No.
Everybody was the same?
No, Bad Orb was the one where they took care of all the separation. And there was nothing at the second camp. The culmination of our stay at the second camp came when we started to hear the guns in the city near us, Ziegenhain. Later on, in later years, the Germans changed the name of that city to Trutzheim rather than Ziegenheim. I have no idea for the reason, but nonetheless, we knew that the GIs were getting close. Everybody in the camp knew that the GIs were getting close.
Did the Germans leave, or did they?
Well, they decided that they better take off, but what they wanted to do was take us with them. Well, we had an American officer. He was a medical man. He was a doctor in the camp, and he came up with a plan. Every time the Germans wanted to do something, they would line you up outside and they would count you. That was their way of making sure that nobody had escaped. You couldn't escape from this place anyway. A couple of guys tried it, and they were shot. So,
Do you remember the name of this officer?
Morgan.
First name?
I want to say Edward. I got it in here. Morgan, in fact, if you'll give me a minute, I might even, here we go. Okay, French and British moved out of Stalag. Americans, after lining up, allowed to remain. Stalag 9A Ziegenheim officially turned over to American officer Captain Morgan. And we were liberated by the 6th Armored Division, 3rd Army, and the 90th Infantry Division. And I'll read this to you, a day to remember, March 29th, 1945. At 0800, we fell out in formation so the Germans could move us out of the Stalag in groups. Previously, on the instructions of Captain Morgan, a certain number of the men were told to feign fainting and sickness, the results of which far exceeded anyone's wildest hopes. While half of the men collapsed, the others carried them into the barracks where they were treated. In the meantime, the French and English had been moved out. After a while, the Germans told us that they would only take 150 of us. When the first group fell out, the Germans changed their mind and decided they wouldn't move any of us at all. We got a very thick barley soup and French bread. By early evening, all the Germans had taken off or given themselves up. The camp was ours. The next day, March 30, we were liberated. White flags were displayed from all the towns. A 6th Armored Jeep was the first American vehicle to enter the camp. What a sight. We got twice as much chow, and we're told that we'd leave at any time. Well, I didn't leave for about 10 days, I guess, something like that. And the few Russians, French, English were overwhelmed at their good fortune. They couldn't praise the Americans enough. Can we blame them?
I have a question. When you went back to a regular diet after being on a starvation diet, was that a medical problem?
Yes, for me. Because
Can you say this in a nice sort of way?
all I can tell you is that when that 6th Armored Jeep drove in, he had C-rations, cases of C-rations. C-rations, to me, would be like opening a can of dog food. It had that consistency. And I grabbed the case, ran into the barracks, tore it open, and proceeded to get sicker than I ever thought possible. I couldn't down that stuff fast enough. It was vile, but it was food, and it was supposedly American food. And that was my experience with that. I might also add, after about 10 days, we were flown out of the camp to Le Havre, France. And at the airport, they had set up medical tents. And they gave us what I call perfunctory medical exams. Perfunctory meaning not too serious and not too comprehensive. In other words, open your mouth, say R, move over there, that kind of thing. And that was the problem. That was the problem that was created for the government in later years when all the GIs started to come up with all kinds of medical problems. But nonetheless, they told me then, he said, we're going to give you two options. We can either send you to a hospital in Rouen, which was south of where we were, or we can send you to what was called Camp Lucky Strike. Camp Lucky Strike was like a rehabilitation camp where they took the men, they re-outfitted them with clothes, a duffel bag loaded with clothes, and they put them on a ship back to the States. I weighed about 110. I opted for the hospital. And I said, send me to the hospital. So they put about a dozen of us in an ambulance and drove us down to Rouen, which was heavily bombed. It's sort of a city of churches. And I spent 3 weeks in the hospital there, never got out of bed. They woke me up at all hours of the night, giving me vitamins and food and everything. A week after 3 weeks, they sent me to another hospital in Paris. The big problem there was I never got to see the city of Paris. I remember being driven through the Arc of Triumph, but I wound up, I think it was the 179th General Hospital in Paris for about a week or 10 days. And I started to pick up a little bit, but still very thin. And even though I had an appetite, I couldn't eat a lot of food. And I didn't want to eat a lot of food because I knew how it would react. And so then the time came for me to be examined by the doctors, the medical personnel. And they said, again, you got two options. We can either give you a DOP kit with shaving equipment, fresh uniform, and put you on a plane to the States, or we can send you to Camp Lucky Strike and re-outfit you and give you your duffel bag filled with all kinds of clothes and put you on a ship. So obviously I opted for the plane, keeping in mind that the plane ride that I took out of Germany to Le Havre was the first time I'd ever been on an airplane. So this would have been the second time that I would have been on an airplane. And so 16 of us were loaded on a C-54 on May 8th, 1945. And we flew from Le Bourget Field in Paris to the Azores for refueling, from the Azores to Newfoundland. And we got there in the morning, and the people in Newfoundland at the airport had laid out the nicest, greatest, biggest breakfast that I had ever seen up to that point. And it was greatly appreciated. We were hungry. And then we got back on the plane and were flown to Mitchell Field in Long Island. And while on the flight, the pilot on the intercom said, "Is there anybody here from Boston?" And I was the only one. He said, "Come on up to the flight deck. How would you like to see your city from 20,000 feet?" I liked that very much. I cried like a baby. And May 9th, 1945, I landed in Mitchell Field. And I called my grandmother in Boston. And I had an uncle who lived in Jamaica, Long Island, New York. And when I told her, I used to call her Ma. I said, "Ma, this is Henry." And she kept saying, "Sam." Of course, she was an elderly woman by that time. And I said, "No, Ma, it's Henry." And she kept saying, "Sam?" I said, "Ma, it's Henry." And she fainted. And end the phone call. I then called my aunt and uncle in Jamaica. my Uncle Sam and my Aunt Ruth. And they were beside themselves. And the first thing my aunt wanted to do was take me to Macy's and buy me a pair of shoes. But she also called Boston to make sure that somebody was looking after my grandmother. And then from there, I went on R&R, rest and rehabilitation. They sent me to the Grove Park Inn. At the time, I don't know that I really appreciated the kind of place it is. And
This is where?
in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Magnificent place, golf course, the whole bit. And I had 4 weeks of arrest R&R. And then from there, they reassigned me to Maryland. I'm trying to remember the name of the camp. No. Somewhere I've got it. But I was discharged on November 25th, 1945. Prior to my discharge, they reassigned me to Fort Meade, Maryland. That's where it was. And so in order to keep me busy, they put me in charge of a warehouse, a big warehouse. The thing is, the warehouse was empty. All it had was 4 walls. And it was my job to sit there and make sure nobody got in the place. It was funny. But obviously I handled it okay. And November, I might add a little bit of trivia. You've heard of Clark Howard. Part of the time that I was in Auburn, Alabama, we heard that Atlanta had a very active USO. So I used to hitchhike from Auburn to Atlanta. And in hitchhiking, I used to walk from Auburn to Opelika, which was...
I'm familiar with the area.
Okay. And I'd hitch a ride and get to Atlanta. I met up with a man who was very active in the USO. He's a man that started the Lovable Brazier Company. His name, Frank Garson. I don't know the extent of his family. I do remember he had a daughter, Joy. We got to be good friends. Frank Garson was Clark Howard's grandfather. Joy Howard's son. Joy Howard had married a GI who had come into the Atlanta area and probably participated in the USO as well and met up with her. Well, the interesting part of all of this is that he told me after my second or third visit, because it was close for me to be reassigned, and we had heard that the program was going to close down, and I told him that. He said, God willing, if everything goes okay, when this is all over, why don't you come back and see me, and I'll help you decide what to do with your life. I had a job to go back to in Boston, but it wasn't much. I knew that the laws that the government passed guaranteed that anybody working at the time they went into the service would be able to get their job back. So after I was discharged, I told my grandmother I'm going back to Atlanta, and I was going to look up Mr. Garson. And I told her why. She was very unhappy about it, very unhappy. But I think I convinced her that I really didn't have too much of a future in Boston. Oh, I could have knocked around and found something and done something, but not anything that would have meant something long-term. And so I did come back, and I got hold of Mr. Garson. His plant at that time was on Spring Street. He had a loft, across from the Coca-Cola bottling company. He showed me from his office how he could look down in the manufacturing area where the women were working with sewing machines and making bras and other types of intimate apparel. And we talked, and he said, I believe you belong in the retail business. And with that, he called a friend of his who was a merchandiser at Davison's, which became Macy's and now is kaput. And I went over and talked to his friend. And his friend called a buyer upstairs and said, I got this young guy, just came out of the service, and so on and so forth, and I think you ought to hire him. So, January 1946, Davison's hired me to sell appliances and electronics at $40 a week. The job that I would have had in Boston would have paid me $30 a week. So I was in high cotton. I notified my grandmother, I found a place to live, and I went to work for Davison's. During the 7 years that I worked for Davison's, I had developed an interest in merchandising. I used to walk around the sales floor and see all of this merchandise and wonder and ask myself questions. How did they know what to buy? How did they know what price to put on it? How did they know how many to buy? And so on. So I told the big boss that I was interested in going into merchandising. And he said, well, be patient. In the meantime, he moved me from appliances and electronics to the furniture and bedding department. He said, so that you can get more experience. You can broaden your experience in retailing. After 7 years, I got a call from Rich's. At that time, as you probably know, everything was downtown. Anybody who went shopping went downtown. Whether you drove or whether you rode a streetcar or a bus or whatever, you went downtown. And the streetcars used to stop in front of Davison's, and then they went down Forsyth Street to Rich's. And the executives at Davison's used to stand outside and see how many people got off to go into their store, and wondering, how can we get the rest of the people to stop and get off here, instead of losing them to our competition. Rich's called me and wanted to know if I was interested in coming down the street, as they called it. I said yes. So, on my birthday, 1953, a little over 7 years later, I went to work for Rich's as an assistant buyer in appliances and electronics. In 6 months, I was the buyer. In a short time after that, I became a merchandising manager. And I stayed there over 33 years and retired from Rich's.
On what date?
January 1987. Next month will be 17 years ago. And I've had the pleasure of, one of the fringe benefits was that I got to travel a lot. And I got to be, if I do say so, quite a knowledgeable guy in the electronics field. I introduced Mitsubishi to this market in 1971. I think I've run out of some things, but ask me questions.
Your wife, how did you meet her?
I met her at Davison's.
Okay. Her name?
Her name was Elizabeth. Everybody called her Betty.
Elizabeth, last name?
Sartin.
S-A-R-T-O-N?
S-A-R-T-I-N.
T-I.
She originally was from Rome, Georgia. But she had left Rome to go to work at Davison's. And she had been there, I want to say 8 or 9 years. And the way we met, Davison's had a bowling team. At that time in the downtown area, there was a bowling league. So I decided I'd like to bowl. And we met on the bowling team. And we got married in '52. and stayed married for 51 years. Unfortunately, in 1998, she had a stroke and fought it and lived with it for over 5 years, and she passed away last January.
We'll tie it up with your children, just their names, when they were born.
Alan and Robert. Robert was born in 1955. Alan was born in 1958. Each son married and had 2 daughters. Robert lives in Orlando. He's divorced after about 16 or 17 years, but his 2 daughters live in this area, or I should say live in the Roswell area. The oldest daughter, Jennifer, is 23. She graduated from Freeman. She's now a teacher at Roswell High School. The younger daughter, who's 3 years younger, Haley, and I might add both beautiful, beautiful gals and loving gals and so on. Haley is a sophomore at Samford University in Birmingham, and she wants to be an elementary school teacher. My younger son, and I might add that Robert is in the electronics business. He's with an electronics chain in retailing down in Orlando. My younger son, Alan, got married a girl from Ringgold, wonderful, wonderful girl, Holly. They've been married about 17 years. They have one girl, 11, Tori, another girl, JC, who is 3. And Alan is with Philips Electronics. He's a national sales manager with them in one of their groups.
Just like your dad.
In a way, they both wound up in electronics, very interesting. And he lives in the Sewanee area. I sold my house in Roswell, moved to Sewanee, have an apartment. Met this beautiful young lady here. We've become friends. And I wanted her to be with me today to participate in what I feel is a real privilege.
We're delighted to have you. In fact, Mr. Freeman, my feeling is that you really are a member of the great generation. And the ones that have come afterwards, I'm afraid, are just a pale imitation of what you've done. And we thank you for
Well, I thank you for that.